Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and start? I'd like to welcome everybody to the February edition of the Tower Center Monthly Seminar. Our speaker today probably needs no introduction to most everybody in this room, but I'll introduce him anyway.
No, that's good.
This is Professor Jeff Engel, Professor of History and founding director of the Center for Presidential History, just across the way. A longtime collaborator with the Tower Center, and in fact, the senior fellow at the Tower Center here. Jeff is also the recipient of this year's Colin Powell Faculty Fellowship, which supports research broadly related to America's role in the world and what President George H.W. Bush called the New World Order and America's place in it. And I can think of no Powell Faculty Fellowship winner whose work is more closely related to the point of that fellowship than the work that Jeff will be talking about today. The title of his talk is When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the Surprisingly Peaceful End of the Cold War. So with that, I'd like to welcome everybody, and please join me in welcoming Professor Engel.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Jim, and thank you, everyone at the Tower Center. It's a wonderful thing to be involved with the Tower Center, as of course everybody in this room knows. It's a great honor, and it's a particular honor to be a Powell Fellowship winner, which was very helpful in allowing me to finish up the last interviews I wanted to do with President Bush and with his inner circle for this project. I do note, and I cannot help but note, that we are meeting on a day that began with a blizzard, since I do recall Jim saying at one point that it will be a cold day in hell before I spoke to this group again. So it seems to have worked out quite well. So
I don't believe a word of it.
So what I want to talk to you about today is the broad outlines of this book, and Josh asked me to speak for about 20 minutes or so, which knowing me means I'll go for about 2 hours. But more importantly, I do intend to try to open this up for discussion to get everyone's thoughts and views on something which I think is a critical moment in history that, frankly, we don't appreciate for just how critical and potentially dangerous it was, and that is the end of the Cold War. I am currently writing a book on the end of the Cold War, which began as a study of U.S. foreign policy during the H.W. Bush administration, has morphed into two separate things, in fact, which is one of the reasons why it keeps morphing into a larger and larger number of pages. It's simultaneously a biography of Bush himself and a group biography of his foreign policy team. But also, it is essentially an international history of the end of the Cold War. One of the things that makes this study possible in the first place is the incredible work that's been done at the archives, especially not only at the National Security Archive in Washington, but also at the George H.W. Bush Archive down in College Station. And I should say, especially given where we are at SMU, from here on in, when I say Bush, I'm talking about Bush 41. Lest there be any confusion, the younger Bush will not show up in this story today. So there's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done in declassification efforts by the Bush Library, such that I think for the first time we finally have the opportunity to really write a document-based history of American foreign policy during this period. Just to give you one spot example of this is a project that I have been involved with since 2004. Others, of course, have been involved in the declassification effort for those documents much longer before I. But just last month, I received about 6,000 new documents that just show up in a big box in my office of things that, frankly, I have no idea what's in there, because it's things that I applied for back in 2004. And by the way, because of the way that the federal government operates its declassification efforts at this point, and I'm happy to go on at some length about this, there is no rhyme nor reason to what documents you get. So consequently, we basically are getting a flood coming out now, but it's a flood that comes in spurts, if you will. Now, this is significant because this is going on in parallel in other countries around the world. In fact, other countries around the world, and here's a case where former totalitarian regimes are actually much better at this than we are, because those regimes, by which I mean the Soviet Union, all the countries of Eastern Europe, to a much, much lesser extent, of course, on the opposite end of the spectrum, Communist China, those regimes that do not exist anymore have less of an incentive to hold on to their documents for obvious reasons. So consequently, we know a heck of a lot of what went on behind the Iron Curtain. And when I mean behind the Iron Curtain, I mean within the internal discussions at the highest levels of power by policymakers dealing with a crumbling Soviet empire, not only within Moscow, but also within Bucharest, within East Germany, with East Berlin, within Budapest, within Prague, in all the major capitals and in all the major governments of Eastern Europe. We really not only can peel back the curtain, if you will, onto these governments, we actually can sit at the table and hear exactly what these people are discussing and exactly what their inner concerns are. And I think this gives, therefore, the opportunity, faced with the new declassification on the American side, and to a greater extent on the British side and the French side and so on, it gives us really an opportunity for the first time now, 25 years later, to essentially write what I like to call an international history, which is looking at this phenomenon of the end of the Cold War through as many national lenses as possible. And in fact, that's particularly significant for the story I'm about to tell you about my interpretation of what happened at the end of the Cold War vis-a-vis American policy, because this is a case where American policymakers, by and large, were not the driving actors of events. Now, if you are one, here I haven't had a good fight in about 20 minutes, so I will start one now. If you are one who believes that Ronald Reagan won the Cold War by spending the Soviets into the ground, first of all, you're wrong. But second of all, the data doesn't show that in any way, shape, or form, because all of the events that I think are significant for helping us understand the end of the Cold War are largely precipitated, not entirely contained in, but precipitated by actors behind the Iron Curtain. I speak, of course, of Mikhail Gorbachev and the generation of reformers in Hungary, in not so much Czechoslovakia, certainly not East Germany, but also in Poland, who came to power essentially at the same time, by which I mean in the late 80s, really drove events and drove because of a sense that their own system was simply not going to cut it anymore. Here's where Reagan shows up a little bit. Reagan helped remind them why their system was not going to work, but frankly they knew that before Reagan really showed up, that the Soviet system is going to collapse, and what are we going to do about it? And Mikhail Gorbachev, who I think is really the central character in many ways, despite the fact that Bush has got his name on the cover, he is the one that drives what essentially is best understood as a revolution of ideas behind the Iron Curtain, by which I meant that he wanted to not only reconceptualize and revitalize Soviet society, but remake what it meant to be not only a Soviet socialist citizen, but a European citizen as well. And one of the things I think that we have forgotten 25 years later is the way in which all of Gorbachev's rhetoric of a common European home, all of Gorbachev's rhetoric of a new international order based not on confrontation but on cooperation, can only be understood in the broader context of the growth of the European Union at the same time. That on the one side of the Iron Curtain you have people essentially saying, we can solve the problems of international affairs of the past, we can solve past conflicts and the long-term national divisions that have brought us to the brink of war and to actual war time and time again in our past, we can solve that through cooperation. Gorbachev is suggesting not only can we do the same behind our side of the Iron Curtain, but we can even work together. And we can build something across the Iron Curtain, to tear it down, if you will, in order to build a broader European society. And the language of the common European home is extremely telling and extremely significant here on two levels. First, because it really gives you a good sense of how Gorbachev envisioned it. One house, different rooms, people having their own space within different rooms, but the rooms connected. But one fascinating thing about the common European home is that it does not have an American wing. And this is the most significant thing of the entire story, it seems to me, because time and again, when the Americans show up in my story, it's because they are concerned that Europeans, led in large part by Gorbachev, are moving in a dangerous direction. Moving in a dangerous direction which is by and large devoid of American influence. To be a European policymaker in the post-1945 era is to understand and by and large to believe in your heart that cooperation has solved the major problem of international affairs of the 20th and 19th and 18th and 17th and 16th century, which is essentially that we keep killing each other. How can we stop? We can't stop by building up walls. We can only stop by working together. To be an American policymaker however, is to take a different interpretation of history during this period, one that we see throughout the entire upper echelons of Bush's decision-making cadre. To be an American policymaker is to believe that the central lesson of history is that Europeans will go to war unless Americans keep them from doing so. That Europeans go to war, Americans show up, solve the problem, and that when we left after World War I, they were right back at it again. And the only reason they weren't at it after World War II is because we stayed. So for American policymakers of the George H.W. Bush administration, and of that generation, more importantly, they perceived that this entire threat of Gorbachev was not so much a threat that he would revitalize the Soviet Union in some way that could be dangerous. So that was a concern. I mean, let's face it, if Gorbachev is really successful, you go from a country that's on its knees to a country that's once again a competitor. That's always in the back of their mind, but that's not their primary concern. Their primary concern is, what if Gorbachev is really successful in building what might be understood as a supranational European order, which is directed against the Americans? So consequently, as George Bush reacts to tumultuous changes behind the Iron Curtain, he is aware that anything that he does that ultimately excludes the United States from Europe is ultimately going to, in his mind, only result in further conflict requiring an American reintegration with Europe at a much later, much more dangerous date. Hold that thought. The other thing which is driving Bush, and the thing which I think underlies his entire personal approach, but also his entire diplomatic approach, which is a phrase which is best summed up by a phrase I like to use as called Hippocratic diplomacy. You're all aware, of course, of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. Bush believed the same thing. Bush believed that you can really screw things up much easier than you can make them better. And this is really important because of the time period that he's living in, the time period where it does seem very clearly that democracy is ascendant, that markets are ascendant. The Soviets have all just agreed that their system is not working. That's the whole point of Gorbachev, is that their system is not working. And Bush believed very strongly that if history is moving in our direction, if the stream of history, if you will, is moving in our direction, we should just ride the current. Things will come to us in good time. And that we can only make things worse by trying to speed things up. Or even sometimes by trying to steer too much. And he has, as of June of 1989, a primary example of what can go wrong when he intervenes or when the world system speeds up too fast. And that is, of course, the experience of Tiananmen Square, which occurs in June 1989, well before the wall falls, of course, which doesn't occur until November. And for the Bush administration, and this is a significant part of my book, looking at U.S.-Chinese relations, for the Bush administration, they don't particularly, to be honest, have a particularly nuanced sense of what the Chinese protesters wanted. Frankly, I think it's taken us about 20 years to really get a good sense of what they were talking about, because the protesters were very savvy. And as you all recall from seeing with your own eyes through television screens, you saw and you remember the goddess of democracy. You saw and you remember protesters holding up signs saying, "We want democracy now." And by the way, you could read them because they were writing those signs in English. Bush and James Baker and others were very persuaded by the fact that if the world is moving towards democracy, if Eastern Europe is moving towards democracy, and now we see Chinese students holding up signs saying, "We want democracy," they must all want the same thing. Now, it turns out, this is a big aside, but I think an important one, that the more that we find out about the Chinese protest movement, the more we understand that they were very savvy in using the word democracy because they knew that CNN would pick it up. But they also understood that their sense of democracy was not George Bush's sense of democracy. By and large, when Chinese protesters, and by the way, you should know that this is a contentious point in the historiography where I have a particular definitive opinion, so everything else I've said is gospel. This is listen. When the Chinese protesters talked about democracy, what they really wanted was an improved Chinese socialist state. Their real concern was not freedom as George H.W. or even George W. Bush might understand it. What they wanted was a lack of corruption. What they wanted was the freedom of opportunity. They did not want the system as it had developed to continue, wherein, frankly, privilege and where you were born and who you were born to had more to determine your ultimate success within Chinese society than your aptitudes. This is a very hierarchical society, of course, as you all know, and the changes of the Deng Xiaoping era, for all that they opened up China a decade before the protests of Tiananmen, had also in many ways reasserted traditional forms of power. Put bluntly, if you were rich and powerful, you had more opportunity under Deng to make sure your kids were rich and powerful than before. And those who were not rich and powerful, i.e. people going to university, wanted greater opportunity. And that was really what drove them into the streets. Okay, that aside is over. Where this comes back to Bush, of course, is that he witnesses the tremendous violence that occurs, and he therefore is very worried that time and again the protesters had used words that he had used in their subsequent protests. So 3 weeks before the crackdown, for example, Bush essentially says, well, of course we're on the side of democracy. Protesters say, look, Bush said that they're on our side. You can imagine how this played out in the Central Party committee meetings in Beijing under Deng Xiaoping, where they are, and again, we have this documentation now, where they were very explicit that if the Americans are in favor of this, then the Americans must be helping to agitate what they perceive to be an unruly criminal order, and consequently, the Americans needed to be taught a lesson at the same time that the protesters were taught a lesson. And Bush was very aware, consequently, that his words had in many ways been used as a formal justification by the Chinese for cracking down on the protesters. And of course, this is exactly the message that Deng Xiaoping told Brent Scowcroft and Lawrence Eagleburger, who both, of course, secretly went to Beijing several weeks after Tiananmen, during a period when James Baker had said famously, we will have no high-level contacts. They went secretly, something that wasn't revealed until later that December. And we have transcripts, both the Chinese and the American side, interestingly enough, of these conversations. And Deng Xiaoping and his cadre are very clear, basically saying, you, the Americans, and Bush in particular, are explicitly to blame for this. And that's the reason why we want to perhaps sever relations. Now, part of the book, as I describe, is Bush's determination not to sever relations, and that takes about 2 chapters to explain how he managed to keep relations going to the best extent possible. But the broader lesson that he takes from this is very significant, which is that as similar protests begin to rise behind the Iron Curtain, he has to be primarily wary not to do any harm. The less he says, the better, because he knows that anything he says can be used to rile up a crowd or can be used to justify a crackdown against crowds. And the latest scholarship suggests that we were much closer to a crackdown than we imagined. There's a wonderful book out by a woman named Mary Serrati focused on about 6 weeks of German history during the protest movements in Berlin, but more importantly in Leipzig, where she has essentially uncovered that when protesters began marching nightly in Leipzig, first weekly, then nightly, this is October of 1989. This is after the 40th anniversary of the East German state, a celebration which Gorbachev had reluctantly shown up to, a celebration where Gorbachev famously told Erich Honecker, the East German leader, that history punishes those who delay, i.e., you need to change now. And more importantly, from their perspective, a celebration in which the crowd of East Germans brought to parade before dignitaries by the East German government began spontaneously chanting, "Gorbachev, save us. Gorbachev, save us from our own regime." You can imagine how well this went over with Erich Honecker and his crowd. They actually wound up giving orders, we now know, to the police in Leipzig to fire on the crowd that the crowds that gathered in protest in October of 1989. Now, we've always suspected that there was a really dramatic moment here where you have 100,000 people in the streets marching around. Leipzig has essentially an inner network circle of a ring road, if you will. And the crowd used to march around the ring road, and they would do one full circuit and go home. The police set up barriers at about the 2 o'clock mark, if you will, on the clock. And we knew that the crowd and the police came together, and then the police backed away. This critical moment when they could have had a melee like they had in Tiananmen, the police stopped. We now know the police actually have been ordered to fire. And by the way, what happened next is a very insightful moment in communist dynamics and in the way a communist bureaucracy worked. Anybody who manages to make it high in a communist bureaucracy understands one critical thing, I think, which is you do nothing without permission, and permission has to be granted 7 times. So when the police commanders were given orders to fire, they verified them back with Berlin. Check. Yes, you should fire. The crowd came around about 6 o'clock on the clock. The police called up again, said, we'd like to just make sure that you really want us to fire on these people. And they said, yes, we want you to fire. The crowd gets to 3 o'clock, and the police call up and say, okay, this is it. We're going to have to fire. We need one more confirmation. And guess what happened? Nobody picked up the phone back in Berlin. And the police commander was very explicit talking to his immediate subordinates. He didn't say, oh my goodness, we have one last, this is not a Crimson Tide moment, if you remember that movie, Denzel Washington. He didn't say we have to follow our last order. He said, they're hanging us out to dry. They want us to fire because they want the crowd dissipated, and they want to be able to turn around and say they didn't give the order. So you know what we're doing? We're going home. We're not going to do it. And literally, the crowd had gotten to about where John Tower's face is from the police at this point. I mean, the Cold War could have come to a crashing, violent end, I think, within 20 yards. And this ultimately is my final point for understanding George Bush and his entire response to this process, which is that they appreciated more than anything else, not only that things could go wrong, but that things could go terribly wrong. And that things were moving in their direction, but the underlying structural flaws within European, but more importantly, Eastern European society were evident and were coming to the surface. Flaws of long-standing hatreds and animosities towards tyrannical governments, as we saw violently expressed in Romania when the government when the people lynched the government in the only democratic revolution that actually turned violent behind the Iron Curtain. This is in Christmas Day and after in Romania. Tensions such as we saw in the Balkans, of course, during the Yugoslav wars, where we see ethnic group pitted against ethnic group once communism and the imposing force of communism is removed. And tensions, frankly, such as we see today in Ukraine, where you have throughout the Soviet Union individual nationalist separatist movements that are determined to create their own national order from the opportunity given by Gorbachev to achieve something new. When Gorbachev says time and again that Eastern European states should be allowed to be self-autonomous and choose their own path, nationalists in Georgia, in Latvia, in Ukraine hear that and say the same thing. And Gorbachev is very concerned that this is going to be essentially what we're seeing today in Ukraine, a breakaway in which you have Russians and Russian ethnics against nationalists within each of the different republics 75 years after the Soviet Union had brought them together. And Bush and his staff are terrified of what this all means. Because keep in mind, not only do we have a major empire that is apparently collapsing before their eyes, it's a major empire with 20,000 nuclear weapons. This is what I say when I began. This is what I mean when I began and said that we have forgotten how dangerous this moment in time is. In fact, let me conclude with one thought given by Bob Gates, who, of course, as you know, went on to become Secretary of Defense for 2 administrations, but at the time was Deputy National Security Advisor working for Brent Scowcroft. Now, parenthetically, by all accounts, this was the most efficient national security organization before or after in the entire Cold War. Every subsequent administration has essentially come in and said, we want to be just like Scowcroft and his group. None of them have managed yet to achieve that level of proficiency. So they knew what they were doing, and they were very, very competent. And Gates, who of course had what is perhaps the most important attribute of any policymaker, he had a PhD in history, he was fond of walking around the White House and pigeonholing people and saying the following, and this is almost a direct quote. He would say, and by the way, he would pigeonhole you whether you wanted to hear this or not, he would say, never before in human history has a major empire collapsed without a major war ensuing. Never before in human history has an empire collapsed without a war ensuing. Now, I will tell you, in terms of professional courtesy, I have not gone back and verified the veracity of this statement, whether we can find other examples of an empire collapsing. That's not really important for the story. What's important for the story is that it sounds good, and everyone believed it. So consequently, as Bush and others approached this optimistic moment of the democratic peace breaking out, their concern, first and foremost, was how do we keep it from going bad? How do we keep something that is perhaps unprecedented from happening, which is the collapse of a major empire without a war? And time and again, as Bush approaches the major critical moments of the Cold War's end, the Berlin Wall, Malta, reunification of Germany, which of course, if you ask Bush, he'll tell you was his greatest single achievement in office, and even the Persian Gulf War, which most people would think would be what he would say would be his greatest achievement, which was framed as the first post-Cold War conflict. Time and again, the Bush administration approached all these conflicts first by saying, first do no harm, and how can we keep the stream of history moving in our direction? And they did that by not saying too much. So, for example, when the wall fell, Bush famously was non-committal in his initial response. There's a somewhat of an infamous spontaneous press conference where White House reporters were brought into Scowcroft's office, in fact, to talk to the president and Scowcroft, who were sitting and watching what appears to be a 12-inch TV, watching, just like everybody else, watching CNN to see what was going on. And Leslie Stahl of CBS News said, after Bush had been discussing this in very monotone and uninteresting terms, said, Mr. President, you just don't seem excited. Yeah. And he said, well, I'm just not an excitable guy. Now, what he knew, and of course what Scowcroft knew, and what Stahl did not, was that he had spent the entire previous night on the phone with Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl and Mikhail Gorbachev, each of whom said, this is all spinning out of control. How do we keep this calm? And remembering Tiananmen, he knew that the last thing he wanted to do was to say anything. Same response with the Berlin Wall, same response with the reunification of Germany, ultimately same response up until a point with the Iraq War, which is the first time, I think, where we see Bush actually breaking with his own pattern and saying, here now, the Cold War is finally over. Here now is where I can stand up and say something definitive. In that case, this will not stand. Because at that point, he knew he could have the rest of the world, including the Soviets, behind him. So ultimately, the title of the book is When the World Seemed New, because it was a moment that was so filled with opportunity and so filled with promise, and that we look back on so optimistically. But the argument I make within the book is that this was actually a very dangerous moment, and we should be very pleased, all of us, that we had an administration in charge that chose to meet this danger, frankly, by doing less rather than more. Thank you.
I will keep the cue, but I'm also going to take the prerogative.
Please do.
Because this is an important book, and it actually could be 2 or 3 books. By the
it's long enough at this point, yes.
Yeah, but it is going to be an important work, and I just wanted to hit on the central
problem in the work, which is not in the work, but in the problem that HW faces, which is on the one hand, you're sensing the possibility for gigantic problems, right? You know that the Soviet Union dissolving might create this whole series of ethnic and nationalist conflicts and just pure raw fights for power. But your basic solution is not to get involved. You want to keep this from you want to keep this stuff from happening, but you can't really do much to stop it, right? As you said at the end, though, there was one time in which he seemed to break from that philosophy, which was Iraq. And he steps in very firmly on Iraq. He gets it out ahead of his advisors in saying this will not stand. They were surprised that he was that strong against Saddam. And we understand now why he was doing it. I think I understand at least why he's doing it, right? Because he sees Saddam Hussein's aggression against Kuwait as a complete violation of the idea of sovereignty. And he doesn't want to see anybody violating sovereignty with the Soviet Union falling apart, right? The great irony being everybody's talking about a new world order, but he's fighting for the status quo.
Yes.
He doesn't want to see a radically different world order. He wants everybody just to calm down. He doesn't want to see borders being redrawn. That's fine. But here's the problem. The Soviet Union's not dead yet. Mm-hmm. And the Soviet Union is an important ally in some senses of Saddam Hussein. And Saddam is counting on the fact that some hardliners in Moscow are going to be helping him at the UN and helping him in his broader claims in the Gulf. So why do you say Bush was so confident that he could get out in front of his own foreign policy and his own foreign policy team in a way that would poke people in the eye in Moscow and maybe put at risk this broader project that he was trying to accomplish?
That's a great question. This is a really great question because there's so many different ways I could go with it. The first is, if you want to understand Bush's conception of a new world order, and by the way, there's an irony to his understanding of the New World Order in that when you ask his advisors what was the New World Order, which I've done, if you ask 10 of them, you'll get 12 answers. And each of them, by the way, then says in the next sentence, we were really going to solve that in the second administration. That was our goal. Like we knew this was fuzzy, and we expected we would have the opportunity to really hammer it out. But I think you actually can make a better understanding of and a better case for what the New World Order was by looking back to Franklin Roosevelt and understanding that for Bush, the entire Cold War is an aberration. And the Cold War essentially thwarts the world that he and his generation had fought for in World War II, which was the world that Franklin Roosevelt enumerated and described, where you'd have a United Nations, you'd have great powers, and you know how that world would be structured, free exchange of trade, et cetera, et cetera. And Bush believed that, okay, now the Cold War is over, we can get back to where we were supposed to be. So it is an incredibly backward-looking status quo hierarchy that Bush is trying to establish. But to the specific question of why he was interested in, use your term, in potentially poking Gorbachev, the chronology here matters, of course, in that this is 1990, mid-1990, this is after the wall is down, this is after German unification has almost entirely been negotiated, which he was primarily concerned about with the Soviets. And he knew, as part of having the Soviets on board for German unification, he had really tied his lot in many ways to Gorbachev, but more importantly, Gorbachev had tied his lot to Bush. The story of 1989 from the American perspective in many ways is, does Bush trust Gorbachev? By mid-1990, he realizes it doesn't really matter, that's the wrong question, because Gorbachev trusts me whether I do anything or not, because I'm his only hope, because I'm the only one who has the largesse to along with the Germans, help the Soviets through their problems. So Bush is very, very confident, I think, that he's going to have the Soviets on board. I'll come back to that in a second. And in fact, James Baker is with Shevardnadze when Saddam Hussein is just by happen. They spent a lot of time together, to be honest. So one would say it's coincidental, but the odds were good that they were going to be together when something bad happened, because they were together all the time, Shevardnadze and Baker. Baker has stated in his memoirs that this was the moment that he realized the Cold War was over. When he and Shevardnadze, by the way, before Shevardnadze had actually contacted Gorbachev, when he and Shevardnadze got before reporters and stood side by side and said, essentially, this is a violation of international sovereignty, this will not stand. Before Bush made his statement even, essentially saying we are against Saddam's, we don't know what we're going to do yet, but we're against what Saddam Hussein just did. And Baker recalls that this is the moment he said, just think about that for a minute. I mean, the Soviet and American foreign ministers had basically not been able to agree if it was night or day for the last 40 years. And now they're standing side by side condemning the action of a Soviet client state. They knew that the game had fundamentally changed at this point. But I will say, in conclusion to the question, that there's a very, very interesting moment that occurs right when the Gulf War is starting. Right when Operation Desert Storm is starting. As you recall, Saddam Hussein invades in August. The Americans, after spending about 5-6 days making sure that they could get the Saudis to agree to let them station troops there, which, by the way, was no sure thing, and really fascinating diplomacy there. They move troops in, but it's not that the conflict to liberate Kuwait does not begin until late January. In the 72, 96 hours or so before the conflict begins, Gorbachev shows up in Baghdad, and his ministers show up, and he essentially says, I can negotiate a peace. And excuse my Saudi, excuse my French, I don't know. This pisses Bush off to no end. And the reason is, first of all, he's worked really hard to get this organization going. He doesn't want Gorbachev to screw things up, by which he means, find some negotiated peace that doesn't prove the point that sovereignty must be respected in the post-Cold War era. It's not that he wants a war, he wants a clean resolution to the conflict. So anything short of Saddam Hussein leaving is actually not satisfactory, and Gorbachev was negotiating in the middle ground. But the other thing that's really interesting about this conversation, about these conversations that Gorbachev and Bush have, is it's very hard to tell tone from a transcript. It's very hard to tell when someone's laughing, when someone's angry, so on and so forth. I mean, as you know, you've all read things, it's hard to tell. We know that Bush was really angry at Gorbachev, and that Bush was yelling at Gorbachev. And how do we know this? Because in the midst of this 2-hour conversation that they had, Gorbachev begins saying, Bush, George, calm down. George, stop yelling at me. George, listen to me, George. Stop yelling, George. George, calm down. And the thing that George was yelling was, don't screw up the New World Order. That Saddam Hussein is peanuts. The big issue is that we're working together. The superpowers are working together. So he was so confident in that he made the underlying basis of his entire approach to not only to the conflict, but to the entire post-Cold War experience.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Jim because Jim has to leave to teach a class, but he wanted a question in first. But I've got to
go teach. You alluded to the West European leaders, but you didn't really say that much about them. And I think both Mitterrand and Thatcher. By the way, everybody you're talking about has got a picture on the wall. Powell, Bush, Baker.
I don't see any Saddam Hussein.
He's behind the screen.
Oh,
okay. She was opposed, very much opposed to the reunification of Germany. So, the generational thing that you mentioned, the way these guys, their worldview, the way they looked at the world order, I guess my question is, was that really shared by the major Western European leaders? Did they really even have a role in this? And I have a somewhat trivial question for you, which is, I don't know if you ever knew Harvey Sickerman, who was the head of the FPRI in your old hometown. He claims that he wrote the speech, he was in the State Department, with the famous line, "A Europe whole and free," that was actually Harvey's pen that's what he said. When was that speech? When Bush said, what we want is a Europe whole and free? Do you remember?
Yes, that would have been in March of '89. No, I'm sorry, May of 1989.
So it was
May.
Well before the key events.
Yeah, so the Bush administration comes into office and initiates a pause in Soviet-American relations because they want to reassess things after Reagan. by the way, not to knock on Reagan, though that's a later book. I encourage anyone who is enthusiastic about Reagan's legacy to go back and read the Republican debates in the nomination fight for presidency in 1988. Every single one of the Republican presidential candidates were working as hard as possible to distance themselves from Reagan's foreign policy. Because everyone thought Reagan had gone too far, was too trusting, had given up too much to the Soviets. Let's not even talk about what's going on in Central America. Reagan did not leave office anyway with enthusiastic marks for foreign policy within his own party. Actually, the Democrats liked his foreign policy more than the Republicans did. So that's another side. German unification. Each of the powers, of course, has their own approach to this, and generational politics and generational experience matter quite a bit. Helmut Kohl, we can just check off really quick and say he was in favor.
Yes, for sure.
Mikhail Gorbachev was not, Margaret Thatcher were not, and the two of them thought that they could work together, perhaps. Thatcher was not, interestingly enough, for the exact inverse reason that Bush was in favor. Thatcher told Bush time and again, I've been bombed by the Germans. And she wasn't kidding. I know what they're like. You can't trust them, period. Bush, who of course had served in the Pacific Theater, which is not an insignificant fact, said, I prefer to look at the 40 years of democracy. And I think people can change. And I think that there's nothing intrinsic to the German character that requires them to be belligerent. And that democracy has taken root. So you can trust them. Now, these are incompatible positions. So how do they come to agreement? They come to agreement because Thatcher is very smart. And Thatcher realizes that she might hate the Germans, but she needs the Americans. And if there's one principal rule of being a British prime minister in the 20th century, it's don't get crosswise with Washington. Especially during an era when the Americans and the Germans appear to be developing a special relationship. So Thatcher ultimately is willing to back away and say, well, I trust you, George Bush. So I will cut a few deals on the side, but ultimately in public I'm going to come out with you. Mitterrand comes off terribly in this story. You can insert your own national stereotype here, but he tries to have his croissant and eat it too. He, on the one hand, tells Thatcher, we're with you. I mean, nobody hates the Germans more than I do. I'm French.
Even though he was a collaborationist.
There's that, yes.
He
he didn't talk about that a lot in these negotiations. So he says to Thatcher time and again, I'm with you. Whatever you get out in front saying, I'll be behind you. Notice he's not going to say it first. He says, I have to have good relations with the Germans. They invade me from time to time. And, of course, they're at the center of the EU. And then when Thatcher would get out in front, he would not be there behind her. And he was doing the same thing with the Soviets and doing the same thing with the Americans. Everybody he talked to, he agreed with. And it was unclear where his position was. Now, you can view this in two separate ways. You can either say, wow, that's pretty slimy. Or you can say, wow, that's really impressively Machiavellian. Because until he knows which way the wind... Yeah, or both. Until he knows which way the wind is ultimately going to blow, he doesn't know which way he wants to set his sails. And he doesn't know, is Gorbachev really going to succeed? Are the Americans going to leave? Are the Americans going to stay? Is Germany going to be reunited? What do I need to do to make sure that I'm on the right side at the end? Well, the longer I can wait to place my bets, the better off I am.
Yeah, we got to run. Great talk.
Which is kind of the way he was with the Germans, right?
Yeah.
He was conciliatory with
very much so. Very
with
much
the Nazis.
So. Yeah.
Jeff, when we talk about the American effort to bring about a peaceful end to the Cold War during the Bush 41 presidency, give us your best explanation for the division of responsibility as between Bush, Baker, and Scowcroft.
That's a good question. Let me give a little bit of background history for those who don't know. Baker, who was Secretary of State, is also Bush's best friend. They were tennis partners back in the 1960s, back in Houston. It's very interesting to note that Bush preferred doubles and Baker preferred singles. And I think that's not, yeah, I think it's actually quite telling. And Baker is a little bit younger, and Baker and Bush had, it's probably best described as a sibling rivalry by this period, where time and again Bush would say when he was fighting with Baker, if you're so smart, how come I'm president? And Baker's response to that was always, well, I'm next, right? I mean, the entire he is very interested in making sure that he is a viable candidate going into the future, and he has an incredible resume working in the Reagan administration before this as well. So Baker, I find really fascinating because he, despite having been Treasury Secretary, he was very upfront about the fact that he really knew very little about diplomacy. Formal diplomacy. I mean, he brought Larry Eagleburger and Dennis Ross with him everywhere he went because they were trained Foreign Service officers and they would know the right thing to do and the right thing to say. So Baker was not a great diplomat in a classic sense, but he was the greatest, and perhaps maybe even the greatest of the entire 20th century, negotiator. You know, he would be able to, Bush would essentially say, go solve that problem. He would show up, identify the one thing that they needed, and would not leave without it. It was really quite remarkable. I mean, if you are in a disputed presidential election, he's the one you want as your lawyer, right? I mean, he's very, very good at that.
He was the quarterback of the Bush team in Bush v. Gore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but he's not a international strategist. He's a pit bull.
A deal maker.
Yeah, that's a better phrase. Scowcroft is more of a strategist. He's a primary strategist. And in fact, we can see over the course of the 4-year administration that Scowcroft's voice and his prominence within Bush's decision-making grows over time, in large part because Baker, of course, is overseas a lot. He's a Secretary of State, and Scowcroft, when he's not flying off secretly to China, is largely in the White House. And the two of them would work hand in glove together, Bush and Scowcroft. So Scowcroft becomes... what's the baseball analogy here? Honestly, he's the. If you want to use a baseball analogy, Scowcroft is
he kind of the bench coach? He's not getting on the field.
Yeah, that's probably. I was going to say he's the manager and Bush is the owner. But if you want to take it down one level, Bush is the manager.
Bush is the manager.
Yeah, and Baker's the stud pitcher, the closer.
There you go.
There, he's Mariano Rivera. This analogy is getting worse. And Scowcroft is the bench coach. But let me say that one of the interesting things, and this is particularly interesting given that Doris Kearns Goodwin was here last night, and she and I talked about this quite a bit. Her book famously on Lincoln is called Team of Rivals, and you know everything you need to know about that book just from the title. That Lincoln assembles a cabinet where people at each other's throats, and that's where he gets the best. The Bush team will tell you that the reason they were so successful was because they were all friends and they all thought alike. Now, it's an interesting case study for a historian where we see the ends basically explaining the means, in that it worked out really well, in my opinion. So it's very easy for people to go back and say, well, the reason it worked out so well is because they were all friends. If it had worked out poorly, it would be very easy for people to go back and say, the reason it worked out poorly was because they were all friends. Because what do you do when you get a group of people who are alike in outlook, in perspective, in temperament, and in politics? We call that a cabal, and we call that groupthink, and that can be very, very dangerous.
Consensus.
Yeah,
Capable of building consensus as opposed to rivals trying to come to a consensus.
but consensus suggests that there's an argument that they resolve, and there's very little argument actually between people. They really do see the world. In the policy differences, and especially vis-a-vis the Soviets, the range of policy differences are extraordinarily, that are being debated in the White House, are extraordinarily narrow. So it's very hard to say that anyone is out in front of anybody else because nobody is beyond a certain range of policy options at any point. They're very simpatico.
So to follow up on what you just said, was Baker involved in, quote, strategy, or was he just kind of boots on the ground strategy? He'd go over there with direction. This is what I want you to do. He's the ultimate deal maker. But obviously, conversations happen, circumstances change, and he had a certain flexibility to kind of make the best of whatever the situation was.
You know, I wouldn't go so far as to say that he was not involved in strategy. That would be a mischaracterization. He's still the Secretary of State. But the ultimate strategists were Scowcroft and Bush himself. And
That's why they wrote. I hadn't read their book, but is that really kind of their vision of the strategy?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
it's fabulous.
It's I would argue it's the single best memoir, post-presidential memoir ever written.
Yeah.
Now it's not. It only talks about foreign policy, which, by the way, says an interesting thing about Bush in and of itself. And given a major critique of him in 1992 is that he only cared about foreign policy. Well, he subsequently writes a memoir that only talks about foreign policy. And there are a lot of things in that memoir. It's great, but there are a lot of things in that memoir that they don't talk about. They don't talk about Panama, for example. Just, you know, they have it's a 500-page book as it is. They got things to talk about.
Sandy Thatcher.
First of all, I think you're in a wonderful position to write a second book comparing the two Bushes' different approaches to foreign policy. Because I think
I like my
what you
job
said
too
now
much to do that.
shows the radical contrast. I mean, we all know that Brent Scowcroft was very critical of the Rumsfeld and Company approach. But I mean, fascinating story there about how they're so different. I just wanted to say that I wish I were still director of Penn State University Press, because we published a whole raft of things, particularly memoirs on the Soviet side. Pavel Palachenko, who was Gorbachev's translator, Anatoly Chernayev, his chief foreign policy advisor. We did a bunch of, Khrushchev memoirs, including Nikita's own. But some other things. Princeton had a conference bringing together top policymakers on both sides. William Wolford edited a volume of that.
That's a great book.
Which had very interesting discussion. But there was another book we published, and here's the focus of my comment, by a foreign service officer named Yale Richman, which is about cultural exchange in the end of the Cold War, because he brought out how so much of the influence on the thinking of the younger advisors to Gorbachev came from, for instance, one of them had been a graduate student at Columbia University. I mean, these people interacted with Americans at all these different levels, and of course there were cultural exchanges and all these things, going on at the time. And so he traces out how these kinds of exchanges really opened up the thinking of the younger advisors to Gorbachev. And this book in particular, I don't know if you know about, Inside the Soviet Alternate Universe by Dick Combs. I mean, it very much, supports your interpretation of how this all came about by internal change in Soviet thinking about, how the world works, essentially. But I'm interested in your sense of what role cultural exchange played, and partly in reference to Condi Rice, whose revised dissertation I published many years ago, because in her, she, as a Soviet expert, she knew how important cultural exchange was. She talked about it in public policy statements, but then she goes ahead and implements the policy of ideological exclusion on behalf of the Bush administration, which is directly contrary to what cultural exchange is supposed to be, even though she recognized the importance of it. And by the way, I have filed FOIA requests to get documents to show how that policy was formulated, and I have run into real problems I'd like to talk to you about later.
Oh yeah, no. Whenever somebody asks me about the FOIA system and mandatory review and other declassification efforts, I always explain to it. There's a great Far Side cartoon that shows a scientist at a board, and the entire board is full up with equations, and then at the very bottom it says, and then a miracle occurs. And his colleague is saying to him, I'm good with you up until that last point. I think that's how declassification works. It's just something happens, and the documents appear, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. I'd love to talk to you about your work with Chernayev. I think that's a particularly fascinating memoir, because it's one of these books where he is such a dramatic writer that it's hard to know what's a real crisis, because everything is the most interesting thing that ever happened to him every single day. So it's great for quotes, but it's hard to get perspective. I think the cultural aspect is really important, but you're right that the administration, and Rice is a good exemplar of this, does not put too much weight on this once they get into office. And I think one way to understand that is that they are by and large all disciples is too strong a word, but they're all influenced greatly by Kissinger and Kissingerian realism. And that, Scowcroft's great line about the end of the Cold War is, why should we negotiate with the Soviets? You don't buy something you're about to get for free. They're collapsing. Let's just keep it from going bad, and we'll collect in the end. And I think that they really were very interested in sort of a nuts and bolts discussion of, well, if it's not about something we can quantify, or not about number of troops, or not about number of missiles, then nothing has changed. So it's nice that we're toasting each other, but it doesn't matter until we see the troops out. So they were aware of the importance of culture, but when it came down to making policy, I think they neglected it to a great extent.
Hey, Jean?
I didn't want to butt in if there was another question, because this is looking forward. I can't ask you about your book because I thought SDI was the reason for the end of the Cold War. But so what do you call the new period that we're in with the Russians? If the Cold War is over, what is this now, and what does it say that Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel are negotiating with the Russians, and we're not there? Could you just talk to that for a minute?
Yeah. I'm going to completely punt on the first question because of what to call it, because I've thought about this a lot, and nobody has a good answer, and I have no good answer. I mean, the post-Cold War era is a not particularly satisfying. If you're defining something in terms of what it's not, you're not actually defining it. And so I don't know. I don't think we have a better term for what we're in right now. And clearly, just war on terror doesn't apply in this context and help us understand Russian relations. I think
more in the Ukrainian sense. I mean,
yeah.
What?
I think it's
history repeating itself. We're getting back to the same situation.
Yeah, Gorbachev was an incredible visionary. He was the opposite of Baker in that he was never good at closing the deal. And as a consequence, I think he created the possibility for a world that was never going to be practical. Now, that's a highfalutin way of saying that the Soviets, when they finally collapsed, thought that they had not only a deal with the Americans not to expand NATO, not to essentially become victors in the Cold War, but more importantly, to accept the post-Soviet world into Europe. They bought into the cultural exchange argument, if you will. We're all good Democrats now, if you will. And Europe and subsequent American administrations were just not trusting them because they said, well, a Russian and a Soviet is still a Russian, and your geostrategic interests have not changed, and we're not really sure that you're European. I mean, that's a whole historic question, and I think that consequently, Russian-Western relations were never going to be as good as Gorbachev hoped. And many of the things that were disappointments to the post-Soviet generation exacerbated current tensions. I mean, the best example of this is Ukraine, and the best example of this is NATO expansion. The Russians are absolutely convinced that they had a deal with James Baker and with Helmut Kohl, but more importantly with Baker, that NATO not only would perhaps not, this is still a disputed question, NATO may or may not expand to include East Germany, but it certainly wouldn't expand beyond the boundaries of East Germany. And the Americans, I think actually the Bush administration was relatively comfortable with that. Remember, it's the Clinton administration that pushes things further. But the Americans essentially never signed an agreement. They wanted to leave that question open. They weren't quite sure they knew what they wanted from Germany, but they weren't quite sure what to do after that. And so you get this bizarre circumstance and dangerous circumstance where if you are a Russian, post-Soviet Russian strategist, and you say, we based our entire destruction of our lives, which, by the way, was a terrible thing for Russia. I was in Russia in the mid-1990s, and I mean, best diet I ever went on in my entire life. There was no food to be found anywhere, and you couldn't go out on the streets at night, and contrast that to 5 years before, when there was no real hunger in the Soviet Union and no crime in the Soviet Union. I mean, people used to famously say you can walk around the streets of Moscow at night freely. Well, that wasn't the case anymore. If you've sold your entire way of life based on the promise that you're going to integrate with the West and the West will not expand in a belligerent way to your borders, and then 5 years later the West has expanded in a belligerent way to your borders, it doesn't surprise me that the Russians don't trust us. And that's certainly Vladimir Putin's recollection of things. Let me just say one thing about Putin, by the way, in this regard. Putin's experience during this period is particularly personally important. He was a KGB colonel, as everybody knows, and he was deputy station chief of the KGB mission in Dresden when the wall came down. Now, in every other Soviet consulate and KGB station, in the ensuing weeks, crowds of East Germans would show up, basically carrying pitchforks and torches, because they weren't hiding what these locations were. Everybody knew that's where the KGB was. They would show up with pitchforks, tell the Soviets to get out. This is our home, and they would go through and rampage and burn documents and basically cause havoc and vent a lot of 40 years of pent up anger. Every single consulate except for one. Putin, when the crowd showed up in Dresden, and the Soviet guards there are armed to the teeth because they don't know what's going to happen, and they're scared to death because this could turn ugly any second now. Putin essentially turns to his guards, his entire command, and says, "Wait here." And he goes to the front door, and he has a sidearm on his side, and he opens a door, and the crowd screams, "Let us in," and Putin says, "No." And something about the look in his eye made the crowd of several thousand realize that this one man with a pistol is more dangerous than 1,000 of us with pitchforks. And the crowd turned and walked away. I mean, there's something about this guy that is.
How about this guy with a nuclear weapon?
Well, he's got him a lot of them.
Yeah.
So.
I wanted to go back to China for a minute. There's an interesting story you told.
Thanks so much.
It's a story of Bush and his compatriots getting it wrong and then realizing that they got it wrong. But Bush had a grounding in China.
Yes.
He'd been there. He lived in Beijing. U.S. intelligence about what was going on in China was pretty good. Why did they get it so wrong? Why did they misinterpret it?
One of the difficulties that I have on a personal level in writing this book is that I've worked with and very closely with President Bush for many years, which is something that never thought would happen in a million years. It was completely happenstance, but we wound up working together on his. I edited his China diary, for example, from the time when he was in Beijing in the 70s. And we worked together at the Bush School a lot, and I really came to like him personally. And to think of him, I found myself thinking of him, honestly, not as a president, but sort of as another grandfather in many ways. And that's important for what I'm about to say. It's difficult for me. Sometimes I ask myself when I'm writing, am I being too critical because I want to overcompensate? Am I being not critical enough because I like the man? And when I start having those questions, honestly, I go for coffee. And I say, okay, that means it's time to stop writing and think about it. The place where I am most critical of him is in his response to Tiananmen. And the reason is for exactly what you said, that he perceived himself to be a real expert in China because he had been there 15 years before, and he had kept in touch. Like once every 5 years, he would have lunch with Deng Xiaoping. Very famously, and Baker used to talk about this all the time, and everyone within the White House talked about the fact that Bush was his own China desk officer, that he was running China policy himself. Now, the problem with this is, honestly, he doesn't speak Chinese. He's a busy man. He's president of the United States. He doesn't have time to keep up on Chinese politics the way a real desk officer would have. And I think consequently his views of Deng were colored by the fact that he had seen Deng do incredible work pulling the country out of the Cultural Revolution, and assigned to Deng, because he was a reformer, the ability to accept all reform, not realizing that Deng was an Old Testament leader in many ways, that what he said goes. And I'll give you one great example of this. If you remember, there was a big brouhaha when Bush visited, and brouhaha is the technical term, when he visited Beijing in February of 1989.
Oh, I know. I was living in Hong Kong, and
Yeah.
I watched that, and I thought that Betty Bell Lord and Winston Lord did a very poor job as the ambassador. And,
There's
and
Yeah, Bush and Lord, as near as I can tell, have not made up since. They used to be very close.
Yeah.
They used to play tennis together and have not since. So, for those who don't know, there was a controversy over a very famous Chinese dissident named Fang Laji.
Fang Licher.
Yeah, my pronunciation. I don't speak Chinese either, so my pronunciation is terrible. And Fang had been invited to the banquet that the Americans were hosting on the last night.
Sure.
Lord, the ambassador, says very explicitly, and we have documentation to back him up on this, that he sent the guest list to the White House to say, does anybody object? Nobody objected. Frankly, they were busy with other things. Remember, this is only 4 weeks after they've taken office. They're still unpacking. And make a long story short, the Chinese declare, after Bush is en route to China, that if Fang is at the banquet, the Chinese leadership is not showing up. So you're talking a very embarrassing international incident that's about to occur. Now here's the important data point. When this is going up, and Bush finally hears about this, he doesn't say, how are we going to solve this? He doesn't say, who screwed up? He says, who the hell is Fang Leji? Now, anybody who is a real expert in Chinese politics at this time would not have to ask that question. That's like saying of Poland, who the hell is this Lech Walesa guy? It demonstrates to me that Bush's sense of China was still stuck in 1974 and stuck with the people that he knew and had not evolved. And because he thought he knew it better, he did not necessarily take input from those who did.
Yeah, my question is, your story about what happened in October 1989 in East Germany, and that was interesting. But similar thing actually was happening in May 1989 in China, and that is when Deng Xiaoping ordered the troops to suppress, they refused, or they didn't do the job. And then Deng Xiaoping had to bring the troops from Xinjiang, the strongest, most powerful PLA troops, to Beijing, and then finally Tiananmen suppression happened.
I would disagree with some of that actually.
So my question is China could do that, still bring the troops from somewhere else, while East Germany didn't do that or couldn't do that. Doesn't this mean this story tells you that the difference comes from the capacity of the state? So none of the East European countries, East European communist regimes, did not have the capacity to control, suppress the protesters, while China did.
I'll be honest. I actually view it differently on two levels. And I see your point, and I think it's really quite good because I don't know to agree with you on a macro level. I don't know what happens if the troops open up in Leipzig and if the troops open up in Berlin. I don't know what happens next. The Chinese, I think, were much more able, because of the capacities of their state, and frankly because of the size of their state, to contain the issue in the different urban centers that it arose in a way that the East Germans, in a much smaller environment, probably would not have been able to. So let me just put that, say, long term, I agree with you. 2 points of polite dispute. The first is, it is true that the troops who ultimately do the violent suppression do come from the hinterland. But the troops who were sent into Beijing on the weeks and in the week and nights before the ultimate crackdown. If you're not familiar with June 4th, you remember, because that's when the tanks and the machine guns opened up. In the week before, Chinese troops had gone in to try to take back the square, carrying clubs, not guns, and they were basically repulsed by the crowd and repulsed by Chinese citizens. And there's all these great stories of old Chinese grandmothers, essentially circling young soldiers who are 17 years old and telling them that their mothers are disappointed in them for doing this, and basically the people rose up. So I think the fact that they were not armed in the same way as subsequent troops is the more significant fact. That after 3 nights in a row, the Chinese government trying to take back the square without the use of, by using force but not deadly force, they finally said, okay, let's use deadly force. And by the same token, to go back to the East German example, I think as near as I can tell, we'll never know, but as near as I can tell, the East German police who were given the order to shoot would have, if they had gotten the final confirmation. There's very little evidence to say that they weren't happy about it, but they were believers in the state, and the fact they couldn't get confirmation is not why they did it, not because the state didn't have the power to do it. The state chose not to exercise the power, or the state, more accurately, abdicated the power to use its power. So.
Getting back to China, I remember reading a book, maybe it was China Wakes by Nicholas Kristof and his wife, but they mentioned, and this may or may not be true, that the same people that started the protests, that many of them, the leaders, the early leaders, had already left by the time
Yes.
of the crackdown, and that many of the people that were caught up in the crackdown were people from the countryside, etc., that got caught up in the thing. But the early leaders had realized that they had taken it too far, and they had already left.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that's true or not.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite true. It's very analogous.
It's really interesting,
Yeah.
the dynamics of that.
Well, so the House of Representatives just last week voted yet again to repeal Obamacare. I think it is now the 64th vote to repeal Obamacare. And when they asked the leadership, why do you keep doing this? Their response is very interesting. They say, well, everybody should have a chance to vote against Obamacare. So you've got new members, they should get to vote against it too, go on the record. Mm-hmm. It's very similar, I think, to what was going on in Beijing at that time, though they weren't arguing about Obamacare. That you had the first group of leaders, they protested, they vent their spleens, and then they went back. But the entire time, more people are flowing into the city because essentially this becomes the Woodstock moment, if you will, for this generation. That everybody knew that that's the place to be. You had to go, you had to spend a week camping out, you had to protest, and then you would go home. And so it's very clear by June that this is going to end violently and ugly and bloodily. It's not going to end well.
Bad musical chairs, right?
Yeah, I mean so the people who are there are either really determined to be martyrs, and we have evidence that many of them were very explicit about that, and also were those who got the wrong musical chair, and then frankly a lot of them who didn't realize quite what was going on. They said, "I just got here. What do you mean it's about to end?" So. And much of the initial leadership was actually very calculating about this, and this does not paint them in a particularly good picture in saying that we are hoping at this point for violence because we know that our protest movement has gone as far as it can without the Chinese people rising up in protest to our suppression. So therefore we have to make sure that we are suppressed. Now, the Chinese didn't rise up in protest to their suppression for all kinds of reasons, but much of the leadership was not unhappy with the fact that violence occurred.
Okay, well, I'd like to take one more opportunity to thank our speaker, Jeff Engel, and thank you all for your wonderful questions.
Thank you all. Thank you, Josh.
Great. Yes, Tom, it's great to see you.
Nothing wrong.
It's been a long time.
Oh my gosh.
You're on several years.
Jeff, great job. I look forward to seeing you in March at our discussion then. I have to tell you a very quick story. When George Bush was governor of Texas in the mid-90s.